Welcome back, everybody. I think we're going to get started. I'm Larry Schwartztoll. I'm the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Program of Study, Research, and Advocacy. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us here yesterday and today for the conference. We are very excited about this panel. And this is a panel that really wants to think about how what we mean when we talk about media is changing, particularly in the context of criminal justice. And there's been a lot of talk over the last couple panels about the moment that we're in with respect to criminal justice reform and how the media frames those questions. And one aspect of that moment is that there is an incredible amount of examination of how the criminal justice system and particularly policing operates in this country. And another really incredible feature of that discussion is that so much of that discourse is framed by information and especially images generated not by the traditional media, but by citizen journalists, by people on the street with cell phones who are the first layers of reporting and framing the discussion around criminal justice. And so we want to talk in this panel about what that means for journalism and what that means for policy, what that means for the criminal justice system. So we have an excellent group of panelists to talk about those questions. As with everyone else who we've brought in for this conference, the full sort of list of credentials and the full bios for each of these folks would consume all of our time to go through, but they're listed in the programs, and so I commend those to you to see the full backgrounds and experiences that each of our panelists are bringing to this discussion. But just briefly, and sort of going down the line, we are joined by, starting on the far side of the line, Morgan Hargrave, who is a systems change coordinator with Witness. Witness is an international nonprofit that uses the power of video, storytelling, and technology to expose human rights abuses around the world, including here in the United States. DeRay McKesson. DeRay is one of the leading voices in the Black Lives Matter movement and an organizer of We the Protestors and Campaign Zero. Ethan Zuckerman, who's the director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT and a principal research scientist at MIT's Media Lab, where he leads research on the media cloud. And sitting closest to me, Carl Williams, who's a staff attorney at the ACLU of Massachusetts. So the format of this discussion is going to be a little bit different than the last two because we are going to be really true to our commitment to thinking about different forms of media by departing from what has been the sort of mono-media approach of people talking in microphones to bringing in some images and videos to help frame this discussion. And so we're going to start with Morgan, and I will.
Yes, there we go. Cool. So hi, great to be here. Congratulations on the launch of the Criminal Justice Program. I'm excited to see that here at the law school. By way of introduction, I'm going to start in cool. Okay. So by way of introduction, I'm going to start in 1991 when the man on your left, George Holliday, a plumber in Los Angeles, filmed the scene on your right, the LAPD beating Rodney King. A lot of things spun out from this moment. Right? One of the small things that did spin out from that was the founding of Witness, which was really focused on this idea of sort of the power of visual media in the hands of more and more people, right? And so it was about building up an ecosystem around that of organizing, of training, of solidarity that can help turn those images and those stories into change. So now people who were telling their stories around the world, human rights activists, could now show as well as tell. And so 24 years later, here we are in this moment where, so the video isn't quite new, right? but the ubiquity is, and the network nature of it is, and the compulsion and empowerment that people around the world, people in America, especially black people in America, feel to be able to document and share and speak out on these issues, that's new as well. And so that's about as far as I'm going to go talking about the moment we're in, partly because I don't feel it's my place to, and partly because we'll probably get around to it at some point. But I do want to cover sort of a few aspects of citizen media that we see in our work. And given sort of my work and given where we are in the program, makes total sense. You would think I would tell you about how these devices and this connectivity is empowering ordinary people and activists, that the inequalities we see and that the bad apples cannot persist in the face of the light being shown on them. And I'm totally going to do that, like absolutely, obviously, like I'm going to say that. But I also want to talk about some of the limitations, partly so we can talk about them here over the next hour or so, maybe solve them, but also to raise up work that people are doing around the country to push those limitations back. And so the first sort of big, obvious, easy one is that the images are one part of the equation, right? So this is Kajime Powell. He was shot 10 days after Mike Brown, a couple miles away in St. Louis. His death was captured, the lead up, the 10 seconds or so between arrival of police and him being dead on the ground. That was caught impeccably by a bystander. Great example of being a citizen witness. And yet his story was but a blip on the national stage, right? The same, in April of this year, Philip White in Vineland, New Jersey, was beaten by police, had a police dog sicked on him while he was unconscious. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital after that. His story made it a little bit down the road to New York media, a little, much less the national stage, right? And in both of those cases, there were no repercussions for the officers. So we don't understand this ecosystem of timing and activism and community and media that determines whether a particular case or even a particular video makes an impact in the courtroom or on the street or in the policy realm, right? And we're trying to, but we don't totally understand it. One nuance I'll throw in, this is Askia Sabor in 2010. Was beaten by police. That arrest was captured on video, again by a bystander. He was charged with resisting arrest, with assaulting an officer, among other charges. And once he did get a trial, the jury deliberated for a few minutes before acquitting him of all of that, thanks in large part to that video. It took 3 years, but it happened. And so one thing that we've seen is citizen media being much more accepted and much more powerful as a tool for defense of our rights. But not as a prosecutorial tool, and there's some meaning in there that I don't totally understand, but it's worth thinking about. The second sort of big, broad sort of thing I want to capture is that citizen witnesses capture moments. They capture important, seminal, world-changing moments, as in the case here of the video, The Killing of Walter Scott. What's interesting about this one, about this question in particular, what if there was no video? We know that answer, right? It was 3 days between his death and when the video shot by Fini Santana came out. That was 3 days of news stories. That was 3 days of police accounts of how Walter Scott attacked this officer, took his weapon, and the officer responded in the only way he could to preserve his life, right? We had 3 days of that before the video came out. So we know exactly the answer to this question in this case. So the question for citizen media and social media is sort of where if they can get us to the deeper questions that got us to the context in North Charleston, right? And secondarily, if they can get us to the questions that revolve around, I think this is going to be a panel heavy on policing. I think a lot of our conversations are heavy on policing. But whether citizen media and social media can push us to the sort of surrounding issues of incarceration, of sentencing, of representation, and of discrimination sort of at large. And so, people are pulling together these moments in really interesting ways to show patterns and to talk about some of these issues. This is a photo I took in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, out with some cop watchers there. Jose LaSalle in the cap there runs a cop watch patrol unit. And one way he's doing this is they have studied cover to cover the NYPD patrol manual. And they go out and while they're documenting, they're documenting police activity, police encounters. They're documenting excessive force. They're documenting discrimination, stop and frisk. But they're also documenting all the infractions they can find of the NYPD's own patrol manual. And they're cataloging all of that as broken windows turned back on the police to make a point and to show a pattern. This was a project that we did at Witness in Brazil. This is 114 videos of forced evictions and demolitions. We were working on land rights and housing rights in Brazil. And we spliced together 114 videos of houses being demolished, people being kicked out of their homes, testimonials of those that had already happened, and spliced it together with public statements and video of public officials saying that these things weren't happening and that they wouldn't happen. And we got to present that as evidence in front of a commission where they needed to respond. Right? And there's projects going on in Ferguson, in Cleveland, the People's Archive of Police Violence, and other places where people are pulling together this body of social media and citizen media knowledge so it can be used in these ways. Right? The third one I want to touch on real quick is that the tools are advancing fast. There's more access to mobile phones than there are to toilets. More people have access to mobile phones than functioning toilets. There's 300 plus hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute. It is moving fast. It is incredibly empowering. It's incredibly exciting. Sometimes it's moving faster than we understand sort of what to do with it, right? And first of all, there's questions for the platforms, Facebook, et cetera, as arbiters of what's too controversial, what's too violent for you to see, of what shows up at the top of the feed, what's most important for you to see, of what constitutes abuse or just discussion. I would hate to spend 5 minutes in DeRay's replies and mentions. I swear I can't imagine what it's like in there, DeRay. And they're like, these platforms are not good at this, and they know it, and they're not clear on their decisions about how they're thinking about this and what they're going to do about it, and they're not going to slow down their growth to get good answers and to figure this out well. So there is a burden on them. There's also a burden on us, and there's a burden on us to understand not just how to pull out our camera and hit share, but also the underlying sort of understanding of things like agency and consent. Things about, so like these images, protection, in a lot of the contexts we deal with LGBT activists in Russia, or ethnic minorities in places like Burma or Malaysia, re-victimization and putting people in danger by trying to share their stories is a real thing. So we work a lot on both technical fixes and sort of tactical work on how to use media effectively, visual media in this way. And I mean, the number of times that I've seen young black people subjected to police violence in screenshot form or, God forbid, in GIF form or at an autoplay as I scroll down, I've lost count, right? And so our understanding is not keeping up with the tools. I wanted to share this one. This is Kevin Moore. He filmed the arrest of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. He's now a committed activist and cop watcher. If you run into Kevin, he has a phone in his pocket. We talk all the time about how we all have phones in our pockets. We can pull them out at any point. But he has a video camera at all times as well. And it's an interesting point of, in our work, equipping people and working on this, the activist networks that we work with, people equipping their networks with cameras, which seems to surprise people, and it's a little backwards. And there's sort of basic reasons for that. They can zoom. So if you're pushed away from a scene, that's nice. They have big storage, so if your phone is full of apps and music and photos like mine, that's an obstacle. It lends a certain presence, especially in front of police, like an intentionality, an authenticity almost that I'm not just a guy. Like, I have a camera, I'm here on purpose, and I'm doing this. I know what I'm doing. But also, it's not connected to Facebook. Like, you have to be very intentional of going home and watching it and deciding what you're going to do with it and thinking through how you're going to share it and when and with whom and who you're going to consult first. So it's valuable in that sense, right? And the last one I want to touch on real quick is that citizen witnesses here in the United States have the right to record, sometimes, supposedly. This is, as a legal question, and I'll leave it to the lawyers, it's fairly settled, right? This is a quote from Kianga Mwamba, a woman in Baltimore who last year stopped to film an arrest. She knew her rights. She asserted them. She was adamant about them, and yet she still ended up arrested, tased, charged with resisting arrest, assaulting officers. Her video was deleted. She recovered it from a remote backup. Luckily, her daughter helped her do that. And again, she got the charges dropped, but no other discipline. so far. The same was true in the Philip White case I mentioned. Bystander videos were confiscated there, even though, again, the officer says, I need this as evidence, and the bystander says, I want this as evidence. And so, this is in the United States, and our work, this right to record is not a thing by and large, right? Even in democracies. Even in Europe and in Latin America, it's not as much as a thing. But here, there's amazing groups doing work. I mean, the ACLU, the National Lawyers Guild, Legal Aid, all have resources on this. They do know your rights trainings. Groups like People's Justice in New York find creative ways to do trainings and with murals and other ways in the community in Brooklyn and the Bronx especially, like this one. So you'll notice I don't have one about a limitation about how we need to sort of related to this, we need to respect the officers and not intimidate the good ones from doing a good, honest job, as in the headlines we've seen recently, mostly because that's dishonest bullshit. And what we need is more and better citizen video. This is seriously the picture they ran with that headline, by the way. It's all riot gear and tanks, for God's sakes. And so it's a question, again, of education and enforcement on this right. It's telling that this is the narrative we get, that it's not, what we need isn't a recognition of this right, we need a promotion of this right. It's telling that local officials and police departments aren't asking citizens to do their part, and that they aren't creating mechanisms and processes for easy submission and review of citizen media in these situations. So I'll finish with that message that we need more and better citizen media in these contexts, and that the conversations we're having here around these tools and around the criminal justice issues that are highlighted by them they're inspiring, and they're being reflected in movements around the world that are working on where people are subjected to state violence and are working in different contexts. So it's really inspiring and helpful to work beyond the United States as well.
So this is me on Twitter. So I'm a protester. Last August, I had about 800 followers on Twitter. I took this snapshot a while ago. I have about 250,000 followers on Twitter now. It has changed the way that I use social media and the way that I am in protest space, just because what I say either sticks a little bit longer now or travels a little bit longer. I use this snapshot just to show, to talk about it a little bit, is that I get about 100 million impressions every month, which is like the number of interactions with the things I tweet. And I say it because, I was just at the Twitter office. I did this talk with Jack Dorsey and the Twitter team, and they said, has this changed the way that you talk? And it was like, it definitely does. I don't say things like, you'll never see me tweet the word insane. I'll never say crazy, because the medical community, when I used to do that, like totally got me. Or, one day early last fall, I said, we will not be crippled by fear, and people absolutely lost it. So those sort of things I'm much more mindful of. And even this week, Fox doesn't love me, and they are doing this. There are these Fox segments now that are using this tweet that I don't have a picture of, and they're calling me like an ISIS sympathizer. Like, that is the headline. It's like Black Lives Matter leader DeRay McKesson is ISIS sympathizer, and it's because I rolled over the other morning when the French raids were happening, and I tweeted, I need to read more about the French raids, but from what I've read right now, they seem like witch hunts. That was my tweet before they caught the women. And I thought that was like qualified enough, but so like the headline is like DeRay calls French raids witch hunts. And I try to be more mindful of those sort of things, but while also like maintaining myself as like a person and using social media. I think about this platform as like one where I am half processing the world for myself and then half trying to like push messages out to people. I think about Martise Johnson, who I know. Martise was a student that was beat up by the police at UVA. I use these tweets because the story of Martise, we got people tweeted. I was in the parking lot of the dentist's office, and I got these tweets. And it came out like the bottom one. It was like this, the bottom one with the picture of Martise is like an email that they had that they were like sending through Facebook. And I got it, and I was like, I can't just retweet this yet because I don't know. Like, I don't know the kid. I don't know if this is true. Like, what is this? And I don't want to get people riled up about UVA if it's not real. So I respond to this student and another student. I'm like, can you hop on the phone? I give my cell phone number. And my question is like, can you tell me that you know Martise Johnson? Like, do you know Martise Johnson? And they're like, yeah. So I start tweeting about Martise. And then I call Netta, who's one of my my protest best friend. And we call the president's office at UVA, and before she tweets this, I call and I'm like, can you tell me what's your public statement about the beating of Martise Johnson? I don't know Martise, have never been to UVA, talked to one student, and the president's office is like, they just don't know what to say. They're just like, we're going to transfer you to communications. I was like, cool. So I go to communications, and they are like, we'll take down your name and number, and we'll follow up with you, and that was that. And then we do this about a couple thousand people retweet it. We completely jam up the phone in the president's office, and then we literally just search for Martise's name, and we just tweet his name. We keep sort of retweeting every time his name comes up. And there are all these tweets from kids at UVA who are saying they're saying I can't focus because Martise is in the hospital, and it gets to a point that the news, CNN, USA Today, all these people are calling me for a quote, and it's I've never been to UVA, I don't know Martise, but you should definitely go, right? You should get to UVA. And this is an example of, we sort of help make this story a story for people. And I think about the kid at Kennesaw State. I think about a lot of the police killings. When you talk about Kajim, I remember when Kajim got killed, and I remember us choosing not to go because at that point we didn't trust the police, but they said that Kajim had a machete. And I remember we were like, well, if he had a machete, we don't know what to do. And, we know that. Have you met the guy who took the video?
No.
He's a protester. And I remember, we look back on it as one of the big mistakes of last August, that we didn't go to review and protest the killing of Kajim. But social media has been such a big and powerful tool for us in this work. I will say the other interesting thing about the platform that I have and so many other protesters is that we also get breaking news like this because people don't know who else to tell, right? So this was a retired police officer had just killed somebody in the subway, and before the news broke, they tweeted me. I retweeted this, and the news went tried to get into contact with this guy. I don't know this guy at all, but the platform's also been interesting like that. I think of Laquan McDonald. The video of Laquan McDonald, who got killed in Chicago, is about to be released, and last night his cousin reached out to me and was like, "I really appreciate you tweeting about Laquan, let me know, please help our family," right? And I responded to her and was like, let me know what else I can do. And that happens a lot. And because of sort of the public profile around protest, I also get family members who don't know how to talk to the media and stuff like that. And it's a lot of behind the scenes work that happens because of this. Twitter's also been interesting because it is, we met with Hillary and Bernie, and it was the foundation was tweets, right? I tweeted to Hillary, will you meet? The campaign said yes, and we set it up. Same thing with Bernie. And that's been an interesting, Twitter's been really interesting. And some of the lighter stuff, I tweeted one day, I want to see, I need to reread The Giver. That was my tweet by Lois Lowry. I think The Giver's a great book. And somebody calls Lois Lowry, and she inscribes 3 books and dedicates them to me and overnights them to my house. And you're like, okay. So that's an interesting, or Snowden, I tweeted about Snowden one day, and long story short, as I got connected with him, and we had this conversation on social media, which became a thing for people that hate me. But again, it was the power of Twitter, which was interesting. I put this up here only because there are a lot of people who hate me. So you're right. I blocked about 17,000 people on Twitter. But one of the hardest things when I think about myself in the reporting space, so I really think of myself as a protester, is that I am a part of the story, and that makes it hard sometimes because while I can go to Minneapolis and I can try to tell this consistent narrative about protests, right? So they're in the moment, but I can say I just got maced through a fence. I've been to probably 20 cities, 300 protests. I've never been maced or pepper sprayed through a fence before until last night. Or the night before last, and there is something about telling this consistent narrative and sort of comparing all of it, because I've either been around every weapon that the police have used in protest or those sort of things, and that's interesting. The hard part is that it becomes this sort of attack on my credibility in a way that is different, I would say, for reporters. They aren't a part of the story necessarily, and I'm always a part of the story when it is a story about the police or protest. We launched this thing not too long ago called Mapping Police Violence, where we mapped, these are all the black people killed by police in 2014. And we did this, we were the first people to combine the 2 major databases, Killed by Police and Fatal Encounters. And now you probably know The Guardian has the Counted, and the Washington Post has their thing that we hate because it only does the people that get killed by gunfire, which we think is ridiculous, right? The police take a baton and hit you upside the head and kill you to death. The Post sort of, I think, in this attempt to do something novel, has erased the deaths of all these people. So we don't like that. And then we launched Campaign Zero, which is like a platform to end police violence, like a 10-prong plan to end police violence. The reason that we only talk about them all together is this idea that the only way to end police violence at the structural level, at least, will be all of these things working in concert, right? So like the end of broken windows policing alone is not enough, right? Like a revised use of force policy, not enough. Community representation, not enough, but all of those working together. This is sort of coupled too with this idea that we need to have a more expansive understanding of safety, that safety has to that an idea of safety that centers the police at all times is a sense of safety that will lead to these outcomes. So safety is about jobs and workforce development and strong schools and access to healthcare insofar as it's about policing. That when you think about the most affluent parts of Cambridge or Boston, they are safe not because they're flooded with the police, but because they're resourced differently. And this idea of like community policing is really race-based. So, you know, this idea that the police should be ever present, playing basketball with the kids, high-fiving people when they get off the bus is only people of color and poor people. Like affluent people are not, you do that in their communities and they're like, get the hell out of here. Like, no, like they don't want that. But we sort of succumb to that and we talk about it as like a really good thing. And, you know, the police shouldn't have to know my name not to kill me, right? Like in community policing, there's like this myth that like if they're just around then they'll be better. It's like, well, they should just be better, right? Like, and that was the crux of what we said to Valerie Jarrett in the White House and Bernie and Hillary and all these other people. You know, I'll just put this up here because we're at the law school and, you know, I was at Columbia Law a couple days ago, and I don't know where the law community is in terms of sort of the major cases that will help us sort of move forward in the way that we had in the civil rights movement. But the police union contracts is something that we've been really keen on. You know, we created the first public database of police union contracts from around the country. We FOIA'd the top 100 or the biggest 100 cities. And the police union contracts are wild. And, you know, when we talk about it, I'm obviously biased, right? Like I think they're wild, but the police have these incredible protections. So there are a lot of major cities where the police, the personnel files are purged in 1, 3, or 5 year cycles for negative discipline. So any write-up, any type of discipline, their files are just purged. And there's no other civil service job where like that is acceptable. Even if that happened with teachers, people would be in arms. But with the police, we've sort of accepted it. Some of them get breaks during interrogations for like meals and rest. Like that never happens to anybody else who gets arrested. And there are a lot of cities too where the police can bring their own recording device into interrogations, and they sort of can just choose what the recording device is. It's those sort of things that like we want people to start talking about, and we're working with reporters to cover it. It's just hard because reporters feel like they don't know enough about contracts, right? So they're sort of in the 10-month plan, and we're sort of like, we don't got 10, nobody has 10 months for this. So that's interesting. And then we do some, you know, not only are we sort of protesting in physical confrontation, but also trying to get people to think about the work differently. So this is one of the sort of policy-related things that we rolled out recently about body camera implementation. We get dinged a lot in the movement because we are sort of proponents of body cameras insofar as we're proponents of videotapes, right? That the only police that we've ever seen moderately held accountable in any capacity, there's been video. So we wouldn't advocate for there to be a video less place, but we do want there to be tight controls around how body cameras are implemented. And what we did here is try and just highlight for people, like, here's how the implementation has happened. I think that with body camera implementation, it's been interesting because a lot of those laws came sort of not at the request of the protesters. People just did it because they were like, we're going to do something. And we are sort of in the Oprah phase of body cameras where it's like, you get a body camera, you get a body camera, you get a body camera, right? And it is sort of the adoption of the technology has far outpaced the guidance, right? So what you get is you get places like DC where the footage will never be public, or you get places where the cops can look at the footage before they make a statement. And it's those sort of things that don't make sense to us. Like, that is not what the protesters asked for. We don't think that is fair and transparent. We don't think that's in the spirit of democracy. So we do try and do these sort of things. I'll go over these. These are sort of my, philosophies about this work in truth-telling, especially using social media, is that we're in favor of simple truths, right? Like, Twitter is a platform where there are 140 characters, and I think what the movement has done well is sort of tell these sound bites in really tight ways that can be easily repeated. We do often say that we have never been the voiceless, we've been the unheard, and social media has been this platform to allow people to be heard differently. Really conscious about like what are the stories that we allow to be told. That for the first time, people of color often face these issues of erasure, and erasure manifests in two ways. One is that either the story is never told or is told by everybody but us, and in this moment we became the unerased. So keen to us is this idea of like what stories do we allow to be told when we become the storytellers. And this notion that we're always teaching about power, that power is always playing in the way that we talk about justice, in the way that we critique justice. And then this last thing is something, again, is unpopular in the movement space, but we have operated in this, like we don't necessarily need, that organizations and infrastructure are two very different things. I think about being in the street in St. Louis last August. There was no organization that like organized the live streamers or the tweeters or the bail fund. Like the infrastructure just emerged that allowed for that stuff to happen. And when we think about this work, it's like, how do we build coalitions that have deep infrastructure but don't necessarily need like an organization to do the work? I'd say that there's so many people across the country who want to be in the work but don't want to be members, whatever the word member means to them, but they want to fight. And how do we create space for that to happen, especially centered around this storytelling narrative and like the fact that like anybody can tweet a video and it matters all of a sudden, and like we can do our work to amplify. So that's that.
Note to self: next time, don't follow DeRay. So look, I'm going to go from the sort of the very practical and sort of looking at, in many ways, sort of the view from the street and the view from the protests to maybe more of an abstract level. But this has a lot to do with sort of my work trying to ask these questions really about what these images, what these videos, what things like Twitter actually do to the larger media dialogue. So I'm going to give sort of a quick overview, but if you want a deeper dive in this, I've got a piece with my friend Anya Schifrin in this month's Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it's free and open, and you can read it, which you can't for most things in that excellent magazine, so go read that piece. But basically, we make an argument that if you want to understand how media can lead to social change around an issue like criminal justice, you probably want to think about this on at least three levels. You want to think first about this question of reach. So DeRay's got a lot more reach than I do. His tweets get seen by about 100 million people in a month. Mine get seen by maybe 1 million in a good month. And that's different. And it's important to think about who's got reach, who gets that sort of attention. But that isn't the same thing as either influence or impact. There's a lot of people who get a lot of eyeballs in whatever they do, but it doesn't necessarily change the media dialogue, and the media dialogue doesn't necessarily lead to outcomes. So we have lots of good metrics for reach. Reach is something that the ad industry learned how to measure a long time ago. How many people saw your ad. All those methods work to sort of count who paid attention to a tweet or a web page or anything like that, but they don't necessarily help you with the impact side of things. Everybody's looking for some way to measure impact. How did bringing media attention to something ultimately lead to a law being passed, or lead to someone being released from prison, or lead to someone being indicted? There's no single metric for this. And the reason there's no single metric for this is that there's no single theory of change. There are people who are trying to get laws passed. There are people who are trying to change public attitudes. And you've got to score those campaigns on very, very different metrics. So one of the big things that I end up arguing is that you can't just look at impact as something where we can quantify it. It's something where you need to be able to tell stories. We look at folks like ProPublica who actually keep a dossier on every story they run to try to track what impacts they think had happened. And that's probably the right way to do impact tracking. But this middle range of looking at influence, this may be a place where we actually can track things. And what I mean by influence is when someone speaks or writes or shares a video or shares an image, does that change the broader social dialogue about a subject? And the way that I try to measure that is I try to look for how a campaign, whether it's an online campaign, whether it's someone standing in front of a TV camera, whether it's someone giving a lecture at a place here, does that change how an issue gets talked about in the media as a whole? So that's pretty abstract, but let me be very concrete about this, and let me sort of go early on in the Black Lives Matter movement. Shortly after Michael Brown was killed, journalists went online, went onto the young man's Facebook feed, and started finding photos of Michael Brown as a way to portray him. And the photo that got used the most often the first day or two was this photo where Michael Brown is being photographed from below, someone shooting from below so that he looks tall. He looks a little threatening. People start referring to the peace sign that he's holding as a gang sign. And this very quickly becomes a way of making clear who the media thinks Michael Brown is. Michael Brown is a young black man, therefore Michael Brown is probably dangerous. And so activists very quickly find another photo from around the same period of time in his photo stream, which is this photo here, where this does not look like a threatening guy. This looks like a kid wearing a varsity jacket. This is someone you went to high school with. And so this campaign starts with the hashtag, if they gun me down, what photo would they use? And it's a way of pointing out that what image ends up portraying a story has an enormous deal of political weight. And you started seeing people like this active duty Marine go onto their Facebook feeds and say, let me find some contrasting images. This is the image that they're going to use if I get gunned down, not this image which shows me as an exemplar of what we hope people to be in American society. And what was amazing was that people picked this up, and they picked it up in a really interesting way. We ended up with tumblers sort of filled with these things. We also ended up with people goofing on it, right? So you'll see at the end of this post, white people, please stay out of this tag. Now, the reason for that is you had a lot of high school kids, white high school kids, deciding that it would be funny to show them in graduation garb and then also to show them drunk at a party, sort of missing the point that this is actually an issue of how black people get portrayed in media in America. And this worked. This shows up 3 days later in the New York Times with examples of how this campaign called attention to this portrayal. And we know it works because we gathered a huge amount of images around this and looked to see which image got used to portray Michael Brown. That initial image of him being shot from the bottom, you can't find that after the first week of this campaign. It just doesn't get used as the image to portray him because newspapers realize that they're putting a political weight on this. So just before I pass from this, a lot of my work focuses on this question of what's activism and what's slacktivism. And this is a term that my friend Evgeny Morozov likes to use. It's basically a way of delegitimating any sort of online activism. And it doesn't really delegitimate the sort of stuff that DeRay is doing when he's out at a protest essentially making media. What it does is it tries to delegitimate the sort of at-home activism of trying to make change through Twitter. But there are cases where participating in something like this absolutely has the possibility of impact. The key is you have to understand that a lot of this activism is about changing social norms. What's going on in a campaign like this is trying to undermine the social norms that young black men are dangerous. And at the heart of a lot of what's going on with police violence, this is not a legal change. We do not need to pass a law making it illegal to shoot Walter Scott. What we do need to do is figure out how we change the norms about how black men are viewed in American society. And going into a medium like Twitter suddenly becomes a way to deal with that norms-based sort of activism. So that's what we study. And the way that we study it is basically we read a whole lot of newspapers. We have been collecting stories from 275,000 media sources. So most of the main newspapers, radio shows, television shows, blogs, activist journals within the US and about 15 other countries for the last 8 years. And then what we start doing is building tools that let us take a look at them and analyze them. So the simplest of these tools just lets us do this comparison. How much attention did we pay to Sandra Bland versus Cecil the Lion? And the answer is we got roughly the same amount of attention at the peak. Cecil the Lion was news for a whole lot longer than Sandra Bland was. What's great is when we can actually do more sophisticated linguistic analysis. So what's going on here is we're looking at attention to the protests in Ferguson in that blue line, and then the protests in Baltimore, right? So you can see you've got spikes of 2 rounds of public protest in Ferguson. You have spikes around Freddie Gray's death in Baltimore. The red line is how often the word riot gets used. So interestingly enough, riot gets used a little bit in talking about the 2 Ferguson protests. It gets used a lot in talking about Baltimore. Near as we can tell from our analysis, the fact that President Obama used the word thugs seemed to legitimate this idea that this was not a legitimate political protest, but somehow a riot taking place in Baltimore. We're able to look at the language and sort of see what that does. Now, even simple analyses like this can mean a lot. I did an analysis earlier this year about attention to the attacks in France around Charlie Hebdo and the attacks that occurred in the same week in northeastern Nigeria around Baga. And we were able to demonstrate that not just in US and European media was there about a 40-to-1 ratio, there is a 3-to-1 ratio in Nigerian media of people paying more attention to the attacks in Charlie Hebdo than to the attacks on 2,000 people in that country. And just based on putting that out, we actually got the New York Times public editor to step up and say, we got this wrong, we missed the story, we got to change our coverage. But what we really want to do with this is much more sophisticated analysis. And I'm going to break out of criminal justice just for a moment to show you how this works. This graph up here, the technical term for these, by the way, if you want to be in the know with network theory, is hairballs. So this hairball is a visualization of 15,000 stories about Ebola in November 2014. Ebola is the biggest story in the world in 2014. What's happening is volunteers who've gone over to help in West Africa are coming back to the US, and the US is losing it. People are freaked out. Ebola is going to kill us all. We end up making this graph by looking for words that get used in common. And we graph stories together when they use the same language. And what it lets us do very quickly is pull themes out of this conversation. So the way that we end up reading this is up there in the purple, there's a conversation about Ebola as a disease. How are we going to treat this? How do we deal with hemorrhagic fevers? We have a conversation about international relief. How does the global community respond to a situation like Ebola or whatever comes next? We have a little bit of a conversation about Africa. This, by the way, doesn't happen at all in US media. It's almost exclusively UK and Irish media. But what does this mean for the people who are actually affected by this disease? We have a big conversation about Texas. Oh my God, Ebola is in the US, we're all going to die. And then we have a conversation that I like to call the Obama's crisis conversation, because those are the 2 big words in the middle of it. You guys have figured out Ebola, Obama, it's both 5 letters, they're both African. It's clearly his fault. And then we're able to pivot on this graph, and we can very quickly see that that is the mainstream American conversation. That's the conversation coming out of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Politico, Bloomberg. That's the way we talked about Ebola in the US. It was really more as a political crisis for the Obama administration rather than something that individual people were facing. So the reason that we end up doing this work is that we see this as potentially a diagnostic for different social and political movements. We did this work for the WHO, and the WHO wanted to know why they were having such a tough time making their points about Ebola. And we ended up pointing them to the very center of that graph, and we started talking to them about quarantine. The WHO is way up there in the purple space, in the medical space. They decided never to use the word quarantine because they thought quarantines were such a bad idea. But quarantine became central to the mainstream media dialogue. And we were able to come in and essentially say, unless you talk about this, you're going to be completely marginalized. So we try to do this work for a variety of different people. We're trying to do this work right now for friends over at Fusion. They did a documentary called Prison Kids, trying to call attention to the problems of youth incarceration. They wanted to do work specifically around this question of something that should be obvious, ensuring that minors are not kept in solitary. So we started graphing and trying to figure out, how do we talk about juvenile justice and youth incarceration in the US? And the really simple answer behind this is we don't. We very, very rarely talk about it. It is an incredibly low attention topic. And the first thing that's interesting about this is that because there's so little attention to this, the voices that come into play are not necessarily mainstream media voices. We're looking here at the 100 sites sort of most commonly represented in this. And the good news is that some of them are awesome, like the Marshall Project. And because the Marshall Project is writing so much about this issue, they show up in ways that mainstream media don't. But because the conversation is so sparse, you end up with, again, using technical terms, whack jobs as well. So one of the major voices in this space is kidswhokill.org, which is a victims' rights organization, which is actually one of the more prominent voices within the conversation from what we're able to tell around this. We're also able to tell that this conversation focuses on specific moments of absurdity. Basically, it's a conversation about individual outrageous cases. So we're drilling down here, and you can start seeing words around Texas and truancy. This is a conversation that happens about the fact that Texas and Wyoming are the only two states in the nation that will imprison minors for being absent from school. In Texas, if you get a sufficient number of fines for truancy and you do not pay them, you will be incarcerated. And if you are 17, you will be incarcerated in an adult facility for truancy. So these are the things that we start talking about when we talk about juvenile justice. One of the big conversations in this is the fact that in California, there are juveniles who get incarcerated for failure to meet their parents in hearings and meetings ordered by the court around shared custody. So there's a case of 3 teens in Oakland who ended up in prison because they were unwilling to have lunch with their father, as the court had mandated. Now, these are absurd, but what's really absurd is the ways in which these are the stories that we talk about in those rare cases that we talk about juvenile justice. We do not talk about, for the most part, the ways in which this is a major issue that we should be working on. So last thing I wanted to say, I knew that I was going to be here with DeRay. I wanted to call out and thank him for the work on mapping police violence. We're trying to answer really big questions like, what does a movement like Black Lives Matter mean? So we took this data set that DeRay worked to put together. We took 101 unarmed African Americans killed by police in 2014, and we searched for how much media attention each death got. And then we built a multivariate model to try to figure out, was there a huge increase after Ferguson? And what we got actually surprised the heck out of us, which is we saw a steady increase in attention pre-Ferguson and post-Ferguson. What we actually saw around Ferguson was less attention to deaths that were not the death of Michael Brown. And we're still trying to figure this out. We've got a lot of statistical work to do on this. This stuff is pretty complicated. But actually, part of what I think is coming on is that it's possible that Black Lives Matter, starting even earlier, was having an influence pre-Ferguson. I think it's also possible that Black Lives Matter has given us language to talk about a broader media and social movement that was taking place even before. In no ways do I mean this research to sort of insult the importance of BLM, but it is really interesting to see that we may be having this moment that was talked about in the earlier panel of a trend where all of this is changing. Everything I'm showing you here on Media Cloud, this is an open source, open data system. My lab works on this system specifically for activists. If you're an activist wanting to ask questions about media and social change, we want to work with you. That's how to reach me. Apologies from getting out of the direct protest movement and into the abstract stuff.
How's everybody doing? So my name's Carl Williams again. That was amazing. We want to talk. I want to talk. I want to talk.
I want to talk.
So I want to talk about a few very specific things. The first one is a little bit about, I always think of it as cameras facing two ways, right? So police body-worn cameras and citizens with cameras. And I want to talk a little bit about that. It's been said by folks before me. One of the things that I say is about actually, I want to also talk about terminology, because just as lawyers, we use different words, and they have a lot of different meaning, right? So sometimes, and let's talk specifically about Eric Gardner. We could say that Eric Gardner died, right? Or we could say that Eric Gardner was killed. there's a pretty big difference for lawyers, and I think even our understanding in media, there's a big difference between those two words. Killed means someone did something to him, or maybe he did it himself, or someone did it. So there's a death, there's killed, and then there's murder. And I'll just ask you in your minds, I won't ask for hands, but how many people think Eric Garner was murdered, right? I didn't ask for hands, but you can all do that. That's good. That's a picture. You can all tweet us with our hands up, right? And I think that's crucial to use those words. And even we, actually, when y'all were showing a lot of the tweets, it said Mike Brown died. Mike Brown did, in the big circle, in my office, people will tell you like Venn diagrams. Mike Brown did die. A smaller circle inside that is people who were killed. A still smaller circle inside that are people who were murdered. Right? These individuals, these people, and the vast majority of the people, if probably every picture that was shown here, are people who are murdered. And I think what's happening on social media is we get to use the real words, because the New York Times doesn't want to use the word because they say, well, we might get sued, and if we make a determination like murdered. But I think we in our communications, and I keep seeing a bunch of people tweeting out a lot of things here, we should say murdered, right? Because that's what happened to these people. Traditional media, a lot of times, more conservative traditional media, uses the phrase police-involved shooting, or police-involved shooting, right? And that, I think, has been drawn back a lot by community-based, activist-based, organizer-based media, and calling those things what they are, calling those things murders, and calling them murders by the state. So that's just a bit about terminology. Back to body cameras and cop watch and people recording the police on an individual basis or an organized basis. One of the things that the ACLU of Massachusetts and the ACLU more broadly is working on is getting police to have body cameras. But as DeRay and folks have said, having that with very strong policies. Because when the police talk about this, and specifically when the police talk about it in Boston, they say, well, we want body cameras. But don't talk about the why, right? Because why, if I were to ask you, well, why do we want body cameras on police? To investigate crimes, right? Not to investigate crimes of citizens, to investigate crimes that police may be committing, right? To talk about really police accountability, right? And the recommendations that we have to do with police are saying, well, it'd be nice if we had body cameras because we can use them to investigate crimes and we can use them to track folks. That's not publicly talked about, but it's certainly something police are considering. And when we push back and say, you need a data deletion policy. So that's one of the primary things that we're saying. Police need to have a fairly short window of time, some number of months, between 3 and 6 months possibly, to say, look, you don't get to store all this data. Because to use Boston as an example, you have 3,200 uniformed officers in Boston, right? And having all of those people with cameras on a regular amount of time, I don't know the number, but how long do you think it would be before they had video or pictures of half of the population of the city of Boston? You go to like 2 Red Sox games, right? You walk down a street at a festival. You go to first night, right? I just read a story, some technologists, some people who are on the evil bowels of MIT, there's technology that if someone does this, you could have a camera and that is high resolution enough to get my fingerprints. So I do this. That's not far away, right? That is terrifying if that is the case, right? And if we have police with body cameras without very strong policies and procedures, put those two pieces of technology together, and it's terrifying, right? So the first thing we're asking for is a data deletion policy saying that police can't store this information. The second really important piece is they can't use biometrics, right? They can't say, you know, we're going to have a camera and it's going to recognize every person that they walk up to, and they can't use that. They can't use it in a live analysis. So they're, you know, someone's walking around. Some of the body cameras actually are just modified cell phones. One of the companies has just modified Android phones. And it actually fits into a pocket. So if I were, you know, a police officer, unimaginable, but if I were, and that person's walking around and that camera's on, it's possible that it could just tell the officer, oh, that guy, 2 warrants. That guy actually had an assault and battery in a police officer case, but it got dismissed. I'm a police officer. I want to know about you now, right? That is an incredibly dangerous technology. So we're saying that this is not for police to create more of a surveillance state. And one of the third most important pieces is that there's an opt-out procedure. So if a police officer is coming into your house and they have a body camera on, it's recording, they say, hey, look, I have a body camera on, you can see it. before I come into your house, do you want me to turn it off? And not trust, but actually verify, if that's going to happen, that interaction is recorded, right? That interaction where the person says, hey, I'm going to come in your house, I have this body camera on, and you're going to say what to me? Turn it off.
No, thank you.
And I have, now the police officer has that recorded, and when it goes to later litigation and the person says, oh, this is why I turned it off, right? And maybe there's an incident of brutality, and the officer says, well, I turned it off because they asked me to. Okay, show us the video. Oh, what do you mean? Wait, I was supposed to have that on video? Yes, that's in one of the policies and procedures. So those are some of the key points of policies and procedures that the ACLU of Massachusetts is pushing on police departments in Massachusetts. We've yet to have anyone adopt those, but I think you all and the wider community can help push, certainly in Boston and in other cities and towns around Massachusetts. So that's one piece in terms of police-mounted cameras. On the other side, I'll say this: how many people know that that in Massachusetts you have a constitutionally protected right to record the police? How many people know that? How many people just aren't raising their hands? And where do you know that from? Like, where did you learn that? Do you know the name of the case? I actually like that people don't know where it comes from, because this has actually changed culture. And I'm going to brag about me and my ACLU folks who are in the audience. The ACLU of Massachusetts sued the Boston Police Department in a case called Glick versus Cuniff. Mr. Glick is now a lawyer, recorded Boston police treating what seemed to be a homeless person very, very roughly on the Boston Common. He was arrested for that, arrested for recording the police. He had those criminal charges dismissed, and then with David Milton from Howard Friedman's office in Boston and the ACLU of Massachusetts sued the police and said this person's constitutional rights were violated. He had a right to record the police, and that has become, without going deeply into the law, that has become a right that people have. I actually want to separate one thing. In ethics and morals, that is we should always be able to monitor the state, always, whether or not the Constitution says so. Now it is a right that is enshrined in law with precedent that says we can do that. I think personally, in my personal ethics, it is always right to watch what the state is doing, because if we live in a democracy, you can do that. So a lot of times, what is right and what our constitutions or laws say are not in sync, and that's part of the reason the ACLU and a lot of our organizations exist. What is actually right and what are protected constitutional rights don't always jibe. So in the Glick case, a colleague of mine, Sarah Wunsch, litigated that case with other folks, and it's become now a right. And I think things that DeRay is saying and folks from Witness are doing that nationally and internationally, recording the police. And I wanted to show two videos, one before Mike Brown was murdered, and one, so that this was in the spring of 2014, and the other video is from just a few weeks ago, and they're both in Dudley Square, which is the heart of Black Boston in Roxbury. These two incidents happened to black women probably about maybe 50 yards away from each other at a bus station. So let me see if I can cue this up. So I'm going to have you all look. If you look in this corner right here, there's a number of onlookers, and there's some police in this back corner, and they're confronting a woman. So a woman actually was being a woman who seemed to have some substance abuse or mental health issues, was being treated very roughly by the police, by the MBTA, the transit police here in Boston. Mary Holmes, a concerned citizen, came up and said, maybe this isn't the best way to treat her. The police responded to that with force and weapons, and you'll see that interaction take place sort of in this kind of crosswalk, sidewalk area. And again, this is about a year and a half ago. So she's about to get she just got pepper sprayed. She got pepper sprayed again.
That's the homeless
the homeless woman's on the bench. This is the woman who came and tried to have her be protected. That was her cell phone that just got smashed in the ground.
On the ground.
Yeah. So what I'd like you to take a look at is what other people are doing around us. Right? So there are about 100 people, and almost all black and brown folks, poor folks. So now she's being beaten with a metal expendable baton. And then is tackled and taken to the ground. And I'm actually just gonna, if people know Dudley Square, it's shaped like a big T. Up on that strip, there's a road that goes up there. I'm actually gonna show you a video from a bus next, about a year and a half later, about 2 or 3 weeks ago now. A video of another black woman. So this is a lot more clear. You're going to see it in the back of this bus here. And I'd ask you to look at what the people around us, actually this one has sound. I'm not sure if this is going to be super loud or not. But look at the response of the people around. I can just talk about it, and you did see it a little bit. So in that case, on the MBTA bus more recently, you can actually see, like, the folks you saw on the bus there are responding. They're responding physically, right? They're walking up to the police officer and they say, "Stop beating her. Stop beating her." And you can see the person who's taking the video is actually someone who's part of an organization that responds to these things from an organization called Mass Action Against Police Brutality. He's videotaping it. And you can see in front of him, there's probably 6 or 8 other people who are videotaping it. You can actually, on the videotape, you can see, be like, wow, that person's getting a good shot, and that person's getting a good shot. So there's a number of people challenging what the police officer is doing. The police officer uses Boston police officers only carry their firearms, don't carry tasers, and don't carry pepper spray, and don't carry these metal expandable clubs. MBTA, the transit police here, carry, if they're so licensed, and most of them are, they carry metal expandable batons. They also carry pepper spray. He first pepper sprays her. This is a woman who's 4'10", right? So very, very small person. 4'10", probably about 110 pounds. The officer is, I think, 6'2", probably like 260. And she is alleged to have stolen a bar of soap. She was alleged to have stolen a bar of soap. He tells her to get up. She said, what did I do? He takes out pepper spray and says, "Get up." He pepper sprays her a number of times. He then puts that away, takes out a metal expandable baton, starts beating her with a metal expandable baton, then takes out his firearm. He takes out, I'm not certain, but it's most likely because it's what MBTA police carry, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, and on a bus full of about maybe 35 people, and a number of times points it directly at her. And people on the bus are videotaping it and begging him. They're saying, before they were kind of challenging him aggressively, they're like, "Stop beating her. There's no reason to do that." When he takes out the gun, the tone changes, and people say, "Please put the gun away. Please put the gun away." And I'll just say one issue about, one of the first things you learn about gun safety is if you take out a gun and you aim it at someone, you should be prepared to shoot them. The second is be prepared to shoot anything that is behind that person. Because if you shoot a firearm on a bus, in a bus station, it's definitely going to go through that person. It's probably going to go through the side of the bus and hurt or ricochet off something. And with a bus with that many people, it was an incredibly dangerous situation. And to the activist organizers, protesters who happened to be on that bus, 2 of them, and the community that was there, he actually does reholster his gun after about 10 or 15 seconds. He actually puts his gun back on his hip. So I think the work that folks up here and a lot of other folks have done in that year's time has changed to not a single person videotaped that incident, not a single person videotaped the incident with Mary Holmes, to this incident where 10 or 15 people videotaped it, and everyone who was on that bus was engaged in that incident and said, "What you're doing is wrong." In the first video I showed you, people knew that it was wrong, but no one was responding to it. People were sort of just backing up and were cowed, were afraid to respond. So I think that shows some of a little bit we were talking about what is the impact. We see the impact, right? We see the change in culture that people are resisting police violence, police brutality, and police murdering people in our communities. And that, for me, it's horrifying to see the violence, but really when I watched that video, I said, that is amazing, that average people, regular people. And I'll tell you the end story of the Shirley's video story, that the video is not loading, is that folks from the community found out where she was, went to the MBTA police station, which nobody really knows is, bailed her out of jail. People who did not know her at all bailed her out of jail and went and had dinner with her and then took her to the hospital to make sure she was okay. And a quote from her was like, she said, "I don't really know who these people are, but they're being nice to me." And I think that's the world that I want to live in, the one that we're making, the one that folks like you are trying to build, the one that folks like y'all, I keep seeing people tweet things out about this, but that's the world we want to live in. And I think that's part of what this media change is doing, right? It really, aside from the technology, it makes it so people's backbones are stiffened. It makes it so we're not afraid anymore. I just went and spoke to some people at there's a Harvard Legal Aid office that's in Jamaica Plain, and we did a Know Your Rights training last night with some folks out there. I had taken the train out, and some of my colleagues gave me a ride home, and we saw a gang unit pulling over African-American couple, seemingly because they had New Jersey license plates. And we got out of the car and we watched them, and we videotaped it. And they took the people out of the car, searched them, searched the entire car, seemingly on no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and then just let them get back in, and then came up to us. And he looked at me and he said, "You get good video?" And I said, "I did." And then we gave cards to the folks who were there. And the person who was with me had never done anything like that. And I sort of said, "Welcome to the club." And he said, he's like, "I'm kind of terrified right now, but it feels good," right? It feels good. So y'all should do that. How many people have videotaped an encounter, seen an encounter with the police and have videotaped it? So next time we come back, when you see things in the community, videotape it. The other thing that's incredibly important is, aside from the fact that whether something happens or doesn't happen, the other people who see you do it will understand. Right, will understand, like, we can do that. I did this I was downtown, and some MBTA police also were accosting some young folk, what seemingly homeless folks on the steps of a train station. I was recording, and this young guy comes up to me, young person of color comes up to me, he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm videotaping these police." He's like, "You can do that?" And I said, "Seemingly, yeah. At law, yes, and seemingly, we can do it." And he's like, "They're not going to arrest you?" And the police are sort of looking at me like, "We really want to arrest you." But that did not happen, right? And I think that is what we really want to have change here. I think it was Emma Goldman who said, the law is this fixed wheel. It's very rigid. The law is, in all of these things, is the very last thing to change, right? What happens is there are cultural changes, there are attitude shifts, because of the way we live our lives, the way we understand what justice is. And then a long time later, the Supreme Court comes around, or the federal courts come around, or the state courts come around, or the legislatures come around and decide to change that. I tell people, in terms of marriage equality, do people know when the ACLU filed a case to say that LGBTQ folks that marriage should be equal, that anyone who wants to get married should be able to get married? When do you think the first time we filed that case was? I think it was 71 or 74, right? And what particularly changed from then to when now quite a few cases and have been won? What changes millennials, right? It's millennials' attitude towards being less bigoted about LGBTQ issues than Gen Xers and baby boomers. Sorry, us. That's what happened, right? There was a change in culture, and the Supreme Court said, "Oh, gee, it seems like all these people like it, but not us." And that created a situation where they didn't want to be the dinosaurs, right? They didn't want to be seen as the dinosaurs anymore. And they didn't want that to be, and I think the legal arguments support that, but that's what we really need to do. We really need to change culture and an organization of resistance. One other thing I just wanted to say, just because we're here and we're in a time where things are happening, how many people know what this is? Cool. So there's stuff going on over there right now, right? I'll say I only know about this because of social media, and then I came here and I talked to some folks. And if folks don't know what this is, that's the Harvard seal, the Harvard Law School seal underneath that. Royal is a slave. I say slaver is a slaver family that founded the first law professorship at Harvard University in, I think, around 1730, and was back and forth between Massachusetts and, I believe, in Antigua. Was a slaver family, just traded slaves, owned slaves, murdered, actually had some of their slaves judicially punished and executed because of some people resisted, some of those enslaved people resisted being owned. And that money, the money from that, founded Harvard Law School. They're activists, they're organizers, they're people with stiff backbones, I think, who have been emboldened by the movements all across this country against racist practices, who have said, we're gonna confront that. We're gonna confront what is happening there. And through social media, through connections with the Black Lives Matter movement, have said Royal must fall, which is connected to another movement. How many people know about Rhodes Must Fall? So folks at Oxford and other places are resisting Cecil Rhodes, and a lot of things named after him and titled after him, and so those movements have been sort of joined in spirit, and that had an effect on what happened yesterday. How many people know about what happened yesterday? Right, the tape. I'm gonna call it Tapegate. Is that cool? Yeah. But the backstory on that is that folks did this to the Harvard Law Seal, and then someone who was, I guess, is supportive of institutions of white supremacists, or the idea of white supremacists, said you can't go against this seal of a slaver family, took the tape that people put over this seal that is supporting this family that founded that first professorship, took that tape off and thought it made sense to put that over the black faces of the faces of the black law professors here, or the black law professors and the former black law professors, the former professors here. So I think that, I guess they still are, they're professors emeritus. But that series of things played out in the real world, in the halls of Wasserstein, right? And it also is playing out in many ways on social media. And I think, I just put that up here because we are here at Harvard Law School. And so y'all should tweet that, y'all should Facebook that, y'all should share that out, and support the movements that are going on here at the law school. One other piece I wanted to say is, in Boston, there is, as DeRay was talking about cop watches in other places, there is actually a Boston cop watch, folks going out, doing trainings, educating people about their rights in terms of recording the police, and going out there and actually doing that. That's happening mostly in communities of color in Boston, in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. They're doing that with cell phones. People have had discussions about actually getting GoPros and other forms of cameras to do that. But that is something that's happening here in Boston also. I think that's it. I'd really like to hear what folks have to say in terms of questions.
So I want to give folks a chance to ask questions. I'm going to start with just one or two to the panel. It's hard to, I think, talk about the increasing ubiquity of videos of police-civilian encounters without talking about this sort of meme that is in the discussion recently about the Ferguson effect. And so my question is, and so as I think folks probably know, the Ferguson effect is a phrase used to describe the argument that police officers are increasingly anxious about being video recorded, and so are standing down rather than engaging in situations on the street, and that crime is increasing as a result. My question is not to sort of assess the validity of that thesis, but I want to think about the reaction that's had, the very public reaction among leaders in law enforcement. And so there's this very high-profile split even within the Obama administration. The directors of the FBI and DEA have seemed to sort of validate that view. The Attorney General, their boss, has suggested that there's no evidence supporting it. There's been a similar split among people that run police departments. And so I want to ask all of you to focus on sort of a different kind of Ferguson effect, which is to say the effect on people who run law enforcement agencies of the increasing ubiquity of citizen journalism and video recording, and whether what you've observed is that people running law enforcement agencies are scrutinizing and seeking to reform their practices, entering a defensive crouch, not being affected by by civilian journalism and by video tapes of video recordings of those encounters. I mean, what is the effect on how police departments are run?
I mean, I'll say a couple words. I already cussed about the Ferguson effect once up here, so I don't need to do that anymore. But I mean, in my experience and the folks that we've worked with, it varies. There's often a grudging respect and a grudging appreciation from some officers. That's at least expressed to your face. There's often a defensiveness, and there's like all of the reactions that you said are potentially, and you're asking me, like, yeah, absolutely, like all of those. The sort of conversations you will have with a police officer when you have a camera out talking to them, and whether they're in an actual interaction with someone, whether they're actually trying to arrest someone or not, like those will be vastly different from what the rhetoric is from Rahm Emanuel or whoever it may be at the FBI. And I'll stop there to avoid cussing anymore.
I think that, I think the police have been like the least reflective people over the past 15 months, that the rhetoric is actually like amped up, that they've been, I said that the police have been the least reflective people in the movement in the last 15 months. And like, we haven't actually seen the police unions or police chiefs publicly say, like, we need to do some work. I think that police chief in Camden, I think, like, the guy there's a police chief who is, like, getting ice cream trucks to go where do you know what I'm talking about? He's getting, like, the ice cream trucks to go where people sell drugs. Like, he's sort of doing interesting things like that to sort of not have to arrest people but stop drugs being sold, right? Because you put an ice cream truck there, all the kids come, people can't sell drugs. So he's probably been one of the most public people, but he's like he's not McCarthy in Chicago. He's not any of the big city chiefs. And we have seen people like McCarthy come out and say like more police officers isn't the answer, which has been interesting because he's probably the biggest city where he's actually said like more police isn't it. But then he sort of stops there. So you're like, well, what do we do? And it's like, there's no strategy. For us, I would say that I'm so thankful that that reporters got tear gas last August. Like the people from CNN ran quicker than everybody else, which was great because now when the police say stuff like they are skeptical because it's like you got tear gas too. So when they said they weren't tear gassing people, you got tear gas. And even I think about being in Minneapolis, like literally we're like on the protesters had legit like blocked the entire police station. They put tarps up at all the entrances, like they were barricaded in front of the front door and then blocked so the cars couldn't get out. Police were pissed. And they just started shooting pepper spray through the fence. But they're tweeting like, we have not used any, and you're like, okay, I just got maced. Like, I know you did. And it was great because a reporter got maced too, and he was pissed. So then he turns around and gets this like beautiful video of them spraying mace, right? And it's like no longer sort of DeRay the protester said it. It's like, look at Channel 6 who hates the protesters, but like also hates you now, and like that sort of stuff has been really helpful. I will say we've had some like, I've seen police chiefs in the hallway at some stuff, and they have actually been much more reflective privately than they were ever say publicly. And it's sort of like, well, y'all are still killing people, right? Like these secret conversations aren't helpful. And that is hard to be in the hallway and they're like, oh, you guys are right. And it's like, you should say that on TV because people are killing us. And the last thing I'll say is about the Ferguson effect. When I think about reclaiming the narrative, what we talk about is that the Ferguson effect is really people saying a better world is possible and fighting for it, right? It's like, it is what's happening on colleges across the country. People, you think about those kids in Mizzou, and I was at Mizzou. They went to Ferguson, protested, and were like, we can do this, and then they went back to college and were like, we can do it. And that's what I think the Ferguson effect, like in its essence is.
So I think there's two waves of change going on. I do think we're starting to have a real wave of people looking at systemic racism in America and trying to find ways, often within sort of spaces of their own control, right? I mean, the movement on college campuses is very much people saying, how can I be effective? How can I figure out a way to make change? And it's fantastic to see surveillance from the ground up, becoming an activist strategy and really reviving. This isn't new, by the way, right? I mean, this is one of the first things the Black Panthers did in the late 1960s in Oakland, going out and actually watching police. Now, being the Panthers, they were doing it with firearms. They weren't doing it with cameras. But it is a really interesting activist tactic that has a long and proud tradition. But the other thing that's going on is that I doubt, obviously you had, 2 or 3 people on the bus who were trained cop watchers. But my guess is the other 4 or 5 people who pulled out their phones, this is just becoming instinct. And I think it's that second wave. It's that wave of something is happening and I am going to document it. That has a lot to do with citizen journalism over the last 10 to 15 years. That has a lot to do with people documenting terror or other attacks. That change, I suspect, as much as the activist change we'd all like to see, is eventually going to have an effect on how the police handle these situations. But I think that could be slow. These are gradual social changes where we suddenly expect that everyone is going to document when they see something unusual that's happening in front of them. And that's probably sort of a 5 to 10 year shift. And my guess is the police behavior is going to follow another 5 to 10 years behind that.
Like some of my friends would say, we get them free, right? And some people are not good with that. I think people saw probably this, you may or may not have seen this video that came out of Texas, just a press conference video, not a street video. But there was a video of a district attorney who was talking about, there was a sheriff's deputy who was killed. People remember that when the sheriff's deputy was killed, and they said, this is Black Lives Matter protesters, they're allowing this thing to happen. But in response to that, this district attorney, this woman was at a press conference, and I think there was the sheriff spoke, and then she spoke. And her words were the most true thing I think I've ever heard about this entire movement. And she said, she was absolutely like just completely losing it. And she's like, this is terrible, and these people, and they need to stop, and all of these protesters, and it's the worst thing in the world. And then she said this crystal of truth. She said, they are trying to change our very way of life and our very society. And I looked, and she said it, and she was absolutely furious. And I was like, wow, that's it. Yeah, 100%, that is what we are trying to do. Amen. Because there's a system, it's got a name, it is white supremacy, and it and royal, those two things have to fall. But the thing is, the guardians of that are not going to let that happen, right? They do not feel comfortable with that happening because it's taking away these unjust police powers, right? It's taking away those things. So what the response to that is give it a name. Give the thing, that liberation movement, a name that is not a liberation movement, because if you call it a liberation movement, say, you should stop your liberation movement. It doesn't sound so good, right? But what do? You give it a name, the Ferguson effect. Because then it sounds like this minimal thing that just happens to be right now, which, black and brown folks and oppressed folks and women and LGBTQ folks, we've been fighting, since the inception, right? Since the beginning for full rights. And to look at it that way, you can't look at it that way. You can't call it that. Because if you're against that, not such a good person to be against that. But if you're against this thing, the Ferguson effect, which is making police out there and be scared, that's something that sounds it sounds crazy to me, but I think on the front pages of a newspaper, it sounds more reasonable. But I think it's really a response to people getting free.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. I know there are a bunch. Sir? And just, there are microphones in front of each seat, and you need to be pressing
This is extremely fancy over here. I'm from the other part of the university. We don't have this kind of technology. I wanted to go back to a question that DeRay raised in his presentation, which I thought was fantastic. about the police unions and the contracts. And there was a case in California where activists sued the teachers' unions and were able to call into question the existing unions on the basis of violating the civil rights of students. Now, there are politics about school reform that you may or may not agree with. I want to set that aside. But I do want to press the question, since we have a lot of lawyers on the panel and in the audiences, is there a way to bring forward those kinds of cases against the union contracts themselves with this sort of material as evidence? Because I worry that the surveillance footage can have the opposite effect after a while, right? If so many people get involved in filming these incidents, but no one ever goes to jail because they're protected by the same union regulations that DeRay laid out, then people will be demoralized. This is the kind of thing, it's not as if the Black Panthers still exist, right? They at least in their classical guise, the people who are now existing are certainly not the Black Panthers. So I was just curious about that question, about the relationship between litigation, union contracts, and this surveillance footage movement that you're identifying.
Yeah, I hope there's a lawyer here who really wants to, talk about the police union contracts. I think that would be an interesting strategy, right? What I found that's actually been shocking is that people are afraid of everybody. People who know there should be change are afraid of the police unions, right? In a way that I just didn't think. The police are killing people, right? I've killed nobody. The police are killing a lot of people. And people are really terrified of the police unions, which has been interesting. And second is that people, I talked to a lot of lawyers. We're working with the Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn over there. They have essentially contracted with another law firm to do an analysis of some of the police union contracts for us, which is interesting. But what I found is that people don't know how to critique the police unions without critiquing unions, right? Because the police sort of do a wonderful job of sort of saying, well, you don't believe in unions, right? And I will say the police unions have one of the best sort of public service PR machines that I never thought people could do better than teachers, but the police have teachers beat by eons. But I think that would be an interesting, to sue the police unions on the basis of violating the civil rights of people, because some of the clauses are just so wild. So in Chicago, if you get a police officer to take a lie detector test, the person who accuses them has to take a lie detector test and pass it first, which is where does that happen? Or Chicago's actually structurally eliminated good cop, bad cop. Interrogator 2 can't ask a question unless approved by interrogator 1. It's all these things that are never happening to private citizens, but do happen to the police. That's an interesting strategy.
I just wanted to comment one thing about police unions and point people to a source without me giving you all the information, because I don't have all that information. But Christian Williams, I think, is the author, no relation to me. But he has a book called Our Enemies in Blue, and it's a sort of radical history of the rise of the existence of police in the United States. And he talks about police unions. He actually doesn't call them police unions, because even they generally it's called the Fraternal Order of Police. A lot of times the name doesn't even have union in the name, right? Because they operate differently, right? Because traditionally, if I have a union and my boss is there, I say, I want to work less hours and I want more breaks and I want to get paid more. Police unions and management many times are saying the same things. They're we need more guns. And then the management says, yes, we need more guns. And they say, and we don't want body cameras. And management commissioners say, yes, and we don't want body cameras. In many circumstances, they're asking for the same things, which how many people are in unions that's happening, right? That's not what's happening. And they're more, in New York, this is what you saw, right? You saw the unions and the spokesmen for the unions being the attack dogs, coming out and saying, we're going to turn our backs on de Blasio, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And in that case, there was some separation between the brass and the rank and file. But in many cities and towns, they're talking the same talk. They're walking down the same path. So that's a very different structure, I think, than, whatever. You go to a hotel union down the street. Well, there's not very many hotel unions anymore, but you go to a hotel union down the street here and talk to the workers, and if they're talking to you honestly about what they feel about their bosses, it is not going to be that same, almost lockstep collusion. So I'd point people to Christian Williams' book, and it talks, I think he has a chapter on police, Fraternal Order of Police organizations, I'll call them.
We're sort of right at time, but let's get one more question, and I know there are a lot, and then we'll thank our panelists after that. Yes, ma'am. Yes, if you hold the button down.
Hold it down.
This button.
You have to
Yeah,
hold it
hold it
while you're
until-
speaking.
Oh, I have to hold it. Okay. So my question is, what advice would you have for ensuring police reform in Boston is meaningful?
What specific advice or how to make it? So we have three. You can go to, I'll give the plug, the ACLUM.org is our website. We came out with a report on Boston police stop and frisk practices. We're asking that the Boston police all wear body-worn cameras for encounters with citizens and non-citizens, that specific safety procedures and policies are put in place. I mentioned those before. Second, that when people are stopped, frisked, searched, subjected to a Fourth Amendment type encounter, that police give them a receipt. So right now, I'm parked in Harvard Square. I'm probably getting a parking ticket. And I got some due process in that. They will write down where did you park, where I parked wrong, why I did the wrong thing. If I don't think I paid enough of the meter because I'm here for too long. But if I get stopped and frisked, which I do sometimes in Boston, if I get stopped and searched, you know what I get? Nothing, right? And for anyone who's been stopped, how many people have been stopped by the police and frisked by them? That's a telling thing, too. That is an incredibly invasive procedure. You feel horrible after that. Horrible. What do you get from it? Nothing. You try to complain about it? Who did it? I don't know. A guy who had a crew cut. He was in blue, and he had a gun, right? That's not going to help a lot. But having a citizen encounter receipt, so body-worn cameras, encounter receipts when there are Fourth Amendment type interactions, and data. So our guys over here can crunch the data and gals. But we want that data. Who are you stopping? Where are you stopping them? When are you stopping them? Because we looked at data from some years ago, and guess what? Really surprising, black and brown folks get stopped a lot more, even if you control for crime, even if you control for alleged gang membership, black and brown folks are on the worst end of it. Those are three very initial things. And I think that would get us to a place where people can see what is happening and see if improvements are being made or not.
On the receipt point, for New York City folk, shout out to the Right to Know Act,
Right.
which is being considered right now. That hits those same exact points in New York City.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.